The sound of the crowd seemed distant, a muffled mixture of voices that barely reached my ears. The focus was entirely on me. The arena illuminated like never before, and I was about to ride again after so long. My body, still marked by recovery, trembled slightly, but my mind was on maximum alert. Each passing second increased the tension, the fear of failing again. My heart beat strongly, as if it were the only sound I could hear. The feeling of being back in the arena was both familiar and terrifying. I knew what needed to be done, but the fear of not being able to control the horse, of not living up to expectations, was almost unbearable. In that moment, all my preparation, the months of rehabilitation, the fight against doubt, everything came down to that fraction of a second. The arena was ready, and so was I. But was I really ready? When I entered the arena, I knew the pressure would be enormous. It wasn't just about me or the rodeo itself. It was about my recovery, about what people expected of me, about what I expected of myself. All the recovery time, each day of pain and overcoming, was leading me to that moment, but I also knew there was a lot at stake. It wasn't just about one ride. It wasn't just about one rodeo. I was about to face something much bigger, the expectation everyone had of me, and my own expectation of returning to the level of what I once was. In the months leading up to my return, recovery was difficult, but the most challenging process was dealing with doubts. I found myself lost, trying to find a balance between the desire to return to competition and the fear that my body wouldn't respond the same way. Injuries are never just physical. The hardest part was emotional recovery. During training, I felt good. My body was responding, but in those moments of silence when I was alone, the fear of failing consumed me. The fear that my return would be a disappointment, that I was no longer the competitor I used to be, was the hardest to face. And, to be honest, I wasn't sure I could return to my best level. When you go through a serious injury, no matter how strong you are or how much you've trained, you begin to question yourself. I wondered if my mind was ready to return to the arena, to feel that pressure of being at the forefront of competition in one of the biggest rodeos in the United States. I knew people were watching, waiting to see how I would react, if I could overcome what happened, or if the injury would leave me irreversibly marked. Not just the public, but other competitors were also watching me. I felt the weight of those expectations on my shoulders. It was as if the arena were the stage of a great theater play, and I was the main actor, ready to deliver a perfect performance. But I wasn't sure I would be able to do that. The pressure was overwhelming. Every movement of mine would be judged, every mistake amplified. I knew that if I wasn't at my best, if something went wrong, everyone would see and say that maybe I was no longer the same, that maybe my career was coming to an end. The fear of not being able to live up to this pressure was real, and I felt it in every fiber of my being. In the days leading up to the rodeo, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Physical recovery was going well, but what about mental recovery? What would I do when I was back in the arena, surrounded by the crowd, with adrenaline pumping and the critical gaze of all the other competitors on me? This left me with a knot in my stomach, a feeling that no matter how much I wanted to be there, the fear of failure was holding me back. Besides that, there was the question of time. I knew the recovery had been relatively quick, but would it be enough for me to return and compete at a high level? At any other time in my career, I would have been sure I was ready. But now, with my mind divided between confidence and doubt, I didn't know what to expect. The rodeo, which had always been a field where I felt at home, now seemed like unknown territory. I was afraid that other competitors would notice the insecurity in my gaze, that they would know I was back, but not in the way I would like. The preparation was exhausting. Each training session seemed like a repetition of the previous ones, but at the same time, something was missing, as if, despite all the effort, there was still a gap between what I wanted to be and what I really was at that moment. I was in recovery, trying to readjust not just physically but psychologically. Feeling the energy of the arena again, the pressure of the cameras, and the expectation of the crowd would be the real test of whether I was ready. But at the same time, that's what terrified me. I knew it would be difficult, perhaps the biggest challenge of my career, up to that point. The first time I entered the arena after the injury, I saw the rodeo differently. Every movement of the horse, every step I took, was accompanied by a feeling of doubt. The adrenaline was there, but so was the fear of not living up to expectations, the fear of exposing myself again, of showing a weakness I didn't want anyone to see. The audience didn't know the battle I was fighting internally. They were there to see a strong competitor, but what I was trying to prove to myself was much more important than any victory or defeat in that arena. I needed to prove to myself that I hadn't lost my essence, that I could be the same bold and determined competitor I had always been. But that was my internal battle. It wasn't about winning or losing, but about being able to put myself back there, to allow myself to be vulnerable again and trust that my recovery journey hadn't been in vain. External pressure was everywhere, but the real fight was inside me, in the fear of failing and in the struggle to reconnect with my confidence. When I looked at the other competitors around me, I knew they were there to compete, as always. But I also knew that my competition wasn't against them. It was against my own mind, against the fears I had cultivated in the most difficult days of recovery, against the doubt that pursued me during training. I knew that deep down, what I really needed was time and patience, both with my body and with my mind. Now, as the rodeo approached, the fear was still there. But the truth was that even with this fear, I was ready to face the unknown. I knew it didn't matter what happened. I had gotten this far, and the only step to take was to continue forward. As the arena gate opened and the sound of the crowd took hold of me, a wave of nervousness ran through me from head to toe. The noise of the audience, the sound of hooves hitting the ground, and the feeling of being back in that atmosphere charged with adrenaline were intense and, at the same time, disconcerting. I was again at the center of attention, but unlike previous competitions, confidence was distant. The fear of failing, of not living up to my own expectation and the expectations of others, consumed me. What before seemed like a familiar and comfortable environment now seemed like a scene of judgment, where every movement would be meticulously observed and analyzed. Doubt was my constant companion at that moment. I knew the injury had kept me away from the arena, but the feeling of being lost in the crowd of competitors and spectators made me question whether I was still capable of performing the same way. Every step I took in the arena seemed heavier. The fear of failure was present, and I didn't know if I could push it away, as if every movement of mine was being analyzed, not just by me, but by everyone around me. And the worst part, I saw myself lost, still carrying the memories of pain and trauma. While trying to regain the control I had lost during recovery, it was as if the fear of failing infiltrated every aspect of my being. In every movement of the horse, in every adjustment of the reins, I felt the pressure of fear. Would my reflexes be the same? Could I maintain the posture and confidence I had before the injury? The fear of not being able to control my body, of reacting correctly, seemed to paralyze me every second. I was dealing with an internal battle, fighting against the memories of the injury and the anxiety that one mistake could bring me down again, once more, in front of everyone. The fear of failing wasn't limited to the competition itself. I feared even more the possibility of losing myself within myself, of seeing what remained of my confidence disintegrating. I had trained, rehabilitated, but now I was facing a real test, where the risk of failing was imminent. Every mistake, every wrong movement could confirm my worst suspicions, that I was no longer capable of being the competitor I used to be. The fear of not being able to meet everyone's expectations, of being seen as someone who had already passed their prime, was a shadow that followed me in every ride. The fear of not being the same tormented my mind and made me question whether the rodeo was still my place. In the moments before my ride, I realized my mind was full of negative thoughts. I wasn't just anxious about physical performance, but I was afraid of judgment. Afraid of being seen as someone weak, someone who didn't have the capacity to get up after a fall. The fear of not corresponding to what people expected, of not showing the strength everyone imagined I had, became a true psychological battle. I was dealing with echoes of the past, what could have been, what I was, and what I would be capable of being now. Every movement of mine seemed like a risk, a chance to confirm that I was no longer up to the task. At the same time, there was the fear of failing on a deeper level, the fear of failing myself. For me, the rodeo was never just a competition. It was part of who I am. My identity was linked to my ability, to my confidence in my own strength. And now, returning to the arena, I saw myself as someone who had lost that confidence. Every attempt to control the horse seemed like an internal struggle. I knew I could no longer afford to fail. With every wrong movement, I felt more distant from who I was before the injury. What worried me most, besides the fear of failing in competition, was the fear of no longer being able to feel the same adrenaline as before. During recovery, I often wondered if I would be able to feel the energy of the arena the same way. If the pain and recovery had changed something in me, if they had removed the part of me that loved competition with all my heart. The fear that this part of me would be lost, that I could no longer live the rodeo with the same passion, was what left me most in suspense. The hours leading up to my first ride were probably the longest of my entire career. As I prepared to enter the arena, the fear of not being able to control the horse, of making the wrong move, took hold of me. The tension in my body was visible, and cold sweat ran down my forehead. But at the same time, there was a growing strength, a decision that regardless of how things happened, I had to move forward. I knew that to move forward, I would need to face the fear. The first time the bull was released and adrenaline took hold of me, something changed. It was no longer fear, but the determined will to prove to myself that I wasn't finished. I didn't know if the fear would be overcome all at once, but I knew I needed to act, even with it still there. The tension of the first ride wasn't overcome by control, but by accepting fear and insecurity. I needed to take the first step, and that's exactly what I did. The fear was still present, but I knew it wasn't going to define me. Every subsequent movement was a victory against that fear, a way to challenge the doubt that had accompanied me throughout the recovery process. The fear of failing was dissipating, and, as much as it was still by my side, I wouldn't let it control my journey. Overcoming fear wasn't a straight line, but a series of small steps. The most important thing was that, at the end of the ride, I knew I had conquered not just the bull, but also the internal fears that had paralyzed me. The journey wasn't complete yet, but I had taken the first decisive step toward my recovery, and the fear of failing had lost part of its power. The arena, which before seemed threatening, was now just another stage in my trajectory. I knew the real challenge wasn't in competing, but in continuing to challenge myself every day, overcoming the fears and limitations I had created myself. The fear of failing didn't paralyze me, but motivated me to fight harder and be stronger than ever. ChatGPT said, "The feeling of being in the center of the arena again was overwhelming. Every sound, every vibration of the ground seemed amplified in that moment." I'd already faced the challenges of recovery, but the real battle was just beginning. Adrenaline was pumping, but fear still hung over me like a shadow. The fear of failing, of making the same mistake as before, of falling again and being seen as someone who shouldn't be there was palpable. However, one thing became clear to me in that instant. I couldn't let fear paralyze me. I was there, ready to compete, ready to fight against my own demons. When the bull was released and the horse took the first step, the world around me seemed to have slowed down. Fear was the first thing I noticed, but it was no longer the only feeling dominating my body. I knew fear was inevitable, but I also knew it would be my choice whether it took over or whether I overcame it. This moment was mine. and I needed to make it count. The first ride wasn't just a test of physical strength, but a true test of mental strength. I was in a psychological game with myself. The first movement was difficult. Every cell in my body was on alert, aware of every passing second. But suddenly, something in me adjusted. The fear didn't disappear completely, but it became something controllable. Every second on the ride was a battle against it. Contrary to what I imagined, it wasn't a feeling of total control over the bull or the horse. Instead, it was a feeling of adaptation. I wasn't trying to be perfect. I was trying to be flexible. I was trying to move with the animal, adjust to its energy, and this fluidity gave me confidence. I knew that with every movement I made, every small adjustment, I was reconnecting with the arena and with my own potential. As I felt the bull's energy moving and the ride taking shape, a feeling of power was emerging within me. Although fear was still present, I began to feel a connection with the arena, with the rodeo, like I had never felt before. I realized that fear didn't need to be an obstacle, but rather a force I could use to my advantage. The fear of failing, of falling, of no longer being the competitor I was actually fuel to keep me alert, to make me try even harder. Instead of paralyzing me, it made me go deeper, faster, stronger. The bull's first turn was the most challenging. The whole body in motion, the feeling of being shaken by the animal's force, made me feel a wave of discomfort and anxiety. But at the same time, there was something more, a kind of freedom. I realized that as much as I was trying to control the situation, the key was in allowing myself to be carried by the ride, in not forcing control, but in connecting with the experience. I needed to accept that the rodeo, like life, couldn't be completely controlled, but I could find the strength within me to adapt and, at the same time, control my reaction. As the ride continued, something unexpected happened. Fear began to transform into focus. Insecurity was replaced by the certainty that, no matter what happened, I was there to learn and to prove to myself that there was nothing left to lose. Being there, back in the arena, was already a great victory, and the more I concentrated on my movements and how to adapt to the animal, the more I felt a connection with what I was doing. Every movement was a reminder that, yes, I had returned. The rodeo wasn't just a sport. It was a representation of my own path of overcoming. The feeling of control wasn't total, but momentary. It was as if, for brief seconds, I was able to align myself with the horse, with the bull, with the arena. It was no longer about the fear of failing, but about the joy of being back, about the satisfaction of knowing I was doing what I loved again. When the ride finally ended, with the bull being controlled and me managing to stay firm, a wave of relief took hold of me. Fear had been overcome not by its absence, but by acceptance. I had faced fear, and instead of letting it dominate me, I used it as an impulse to continue. As I got down from the arena and heard the sound of the crowd, it wasn't the victory that caught my attention, but the feeling of personal growth. It didn't matter if I had won or lost that ride. The most important thing was that I had faced something much bigger than the competition itself, the internal fear that paralyzed me. The victory was in every second I chose not to give up, in which I chose to continue the fight, even when it seemed easier to run away. The first ride wasn't technical perfection, it was a personal achievement. I had overcome the fear and doubt that haunted me throughout recovery. The feeling of returning to the arena, of being again at the center of action, gave me a power that nothing else could give. It was an emotional victory, a victory against my own limits. At the end of the ride, it was clear to me, fear no longer controlled me, and with that, I began to understand that my real enemy wasn't the bull, nor the arena, but the fear I carried within me. When I got back on the saddle, there was a moment of hesitation. The horse was ready, but I didn't know if I was really prepared. Every movement seemed heavier than normal, every second longer. I knew this ride would be different from all the others. It wasn't just about riding the animal, it was a reconnection with myself, a way to prove that despite everything that happened, I still had what was necessary to be a competitor. The horse, as always, was a crucial part of all this. It seemed to sense my tension, my insecurity, and I could perceive this in its actions. It was as if it were waiting for a sign of confidence, something that would tell me I was ready to go deep again. The horse wasn't challenging me, but the way it moved showed that it was aware that something was different. The feeling of tension between us two was palpable. But that's when I realized something very important. It wasn't about controlling the horse, but about learning to trust it and react with it as a partner, not as an obstacle. At that moment, the focus stopped being the fear of failure and became balance, connection with the animal. I didn't need to control the horse. I needed to learn to flow with it, understand its reactions, its rhythm changes, and its impulses. The rodeo, for me, had always been more than a simple competition. It had always been about this partnership between man and animal. The horse wasn't there to be defeated, but to be understood. And I, as a rider, needed to be more than a simple competitor. I needed to be part of its movement, part of its energy. I felt an enormous responsibility in being back riding again, not just for my recovery, but also for respecting the animal I was working with. The horse, like me, had its own internal battles. It didn't know if I was really ready for it, but it trusted me, just as I should trust it. And somehow this mutual trust began to build. With every step we took together, I felt as if our connection was growing. The horse began to respond to my commands more fluidly, and I began to feel more comfortable in the ride. I was accepting that perfection wasn't in the absence of fear or error, but in the harmony between us two. As the ride progressed, I felt something deep transform within me. The tension and doubt I felt before began to dissipate. Confidence was re-establishing itself not just in me, but in the horse, in the team that was by my side, and mainly in who I was as a competitor. The feeling of being again in the arena, of being in movement with the horse, wasn't just about winning. It was about reconnecting with what brought me there. Passion, courage, and the ability to be adaptable, not to lose the essence of the rodeo. The horse moved with agility, its strong and well-trained muscles responding to me with precision. When I finally felt we were synchronized, the experience became more than a simple ride. It was as if every movement was a conversation between us two, as if it knew I was giving my best to ensure that the trust between us was restored. The connection between the horse and me was the moment when everything came together. Experience, confidence, mutual respect, and above all, the acceptance that I was no longer fighting against my own recovery, but progressing together with it. I could feel control returning, but now with a new perspective. Before the injury, I believed that absolute control over the horse was the key to a good ride. But now, control was in adaptation, in the perception of how my body and the horse's body responded to the environment. It was a dance, where both of us had to give up a little of our own movements to ensure the work was done correctly. I no longer needed to fight against the animal or against the arena. I needed to flow with the situation, accept that, like me, the horse had its own reactions, and that the rodeo was a partnership that required respect. The seconds seemed to extend, while the horse and I competed in harmony, every movement a step toward overcoming. Fear didn't disappear completely, but it became a motivator for our connection. I began to realize that every step forward, every movement of the horse, every impulse it gave me, was a small victory in my recovery journey. The arena was no longer a place of fear, but of confidence. Confidence in the horse, confidence in myself, and confidence in what I could achieve by allowing myself to be vulnerable, by allowing myself to fail and learn, by allowing myself to start over. When the ride ended and I landed firmly on the ground, it wasn't a feeling of immediate victory that took hold of me, but the feeling of reconnection. The confidence that had been lost during the recovery period was rebuilt in that moment. It was as if I had conquered something more important than any medal or trophy. I had regained my confidence in the rodeo, my connection with the horse, and most importantly, my faith in myself. What I realized at that moment was that in the rodeo, as in life, it's not about the search for perfection. It's not about controlling every detail. It's about learning to trust, to adapt, and to flow with what life presents to you. The relationship with the horse that day was the greatest reflection of this lesson. It's not about absolute control, but about mutual trust and acceptance that together we can achieve much more than separately. In that ride, I felt I had taken a big step in my recovery journey, not just in the rodeo, but in life. The moment I returned to the arena was without a doubt the most challenging and emotional of my entire career. During recovery time, I spent hours imagining this moment, but when it finally arrived, nothing compared to the intensity of what I felt. The arena, which had always been a place where I felt in control, now seemed like unknown territory. The feeling of disorientation and the weight of expectation hung over me, leaving me in a state of constant tension. As I approached the arena entrance, adrenaline began to take over, and the mixture of fear and excitement was almost palpable. Looking at the crowd, I saw familiar and unfamiliar faces, but all with eyes fixed on me. It was no longer the simple pleasure of competing that dominated my mind. It was the pressure to prove to myself, to overcome the doubt I had carried within me since the injury. I knew the rodeo would always be more than just a riding competition. It represented my life, my purpose, my essence. There was no way to escape this responsibility. I was back, but in a completely different way. More vulnerable, more aware of my limits, but also more determined to go all the way. When I entered the arena, the sound of the audience intensified, and the silence within me was broken. It was a mixture of voices, applauding, shouting, waiting for my performance. The smell of earth, the sound of boots hitting the ground, the slight night breeze. Everything seemed familiar, but at the same time distant. I knew what to do, but for the first time I found myself questioning. Am I still capable of doing this? Can I be the competitor I was before the injury? The horse was ready. I knew this because it was my partner, but at that moment I couldn't help but feel that the biggest challenge was with myself. Every movement, every second, seemed more difficult than ever. I was trying to recover the confidence I had before, but fear was still there, accompanying me. The arena, in all its elements, seemed amplified by the tension I was feeling. The weight of expectation was crushing. Adrenaline began to pulse through my veins as the horse aligned for the ride. I knew fear couldn't be eliminated all at once, but it needed to be controlled. I needed to accept the feeling that I was challenging not just the rodeo, but the fear of failing. The ride wouldn't be perfect, but it would be the beginning of a new journey. The journey of proving to myself that I was stronger than I thought, more capable than I believed myself to be. The rodeo, like life, requires this courage, this ability to move forward, even when fear threatens to paralyze you. As the seconds passed, tension accumulated. The horse was impatient, and I could feel its energy. It was as if it knew something was different, that the connection between us wasn't the same as before. But the horse also knew I was there to reconnect with it. The experience of working with an animal like this requires a deep connection, a trust that cannot be forced. We need to adjust to each other's rhythms, and this interaction between the horse's mind and mine, although a bit hesitant, began to form again. The signal was given, and everything transformed into movement. The horse shot forward, and my body was pulled with it, as if a part of me was in tune with it. The fear I felt before began to dissipate. Every movement of the horse was accompanied by an instinctive reflex, as if I already knew what to do. Confidence, though fragile, was returning. The horse guided me, but it was the emotional balance I had recovered during rehabilitation that allowed me to be as effective as before. The arena, which before seemed like a fight, now seemed like a dance. The rodeo was no longer just a physical challenge, but a deep, emotional experience. With every movement, I felt another piece of the puzzle being put in the right place. I was no longer fighting against the rodeo or against my fears. I was, for the first time, in total harmony with what was happening. There was no longer the insecurity that consumed me previously. What remained now was the confidence that was growing with every second. The audience, which before seemed like unbearable pressure, now seemed like energy that propelled me to continue. I could hear the shouts, the applause, but it was no longer about what they thought of me. I was there for myself. I was there to achieve my own overcoming. The horse and I were in a harmony I hadn't felt in a long time, and it was at that moment that I realized how much I had grown, how much the recovery experience had transformed me. When the ride ended, the feeling of achievement wasn't about the final result. It didn't matter if the competition was won or lost at that moment. What mattered was that I had overcome the internal barrier, the fear of failing, and more importantly, I had reconnected with my passion for the rodeo. What I had achieved that day wasn't a medal, but a personal renewal. I was, once again, in control of my life and my career. As I left the arena, I felt profound relief. Fear still existed, but now it was under control. I had overcome what seemed impossible, and that was more significant than any external victory. It was clear to me that the rodeo, like life, wasn't about not falling. It was about getting up whenever that happened. And that day, I got up. When the signal sounded and the ride finally ended, there wasn't an explosion of joy like in moments of previous victories, but a deep, almost reverent silence. I knew what had just happened was much more than a simple test of skill in the rodeo. What I had achieved wasn't a physical prize, but an emotional victory. At the end of the ride, it wasn't the applause of the crowd or the admiring looks of other competitors that touched me. It was the understanding that I had overcome myself. The fear that had paralyzed me, that almost made me give up, was no longer my enemy. I had learned to work with it, to use it as fuel for my own overcoming. It was a moment of silent reflection. The horse, now calm, led me back to the arena backstage, and I could barely process what had just happened. The feeling of relief was immense, but at the same time there was internal growth. I was aware that on that day I hadn't just won the rodeo or the bull. I had won the greatest adversary of all, the fear I carried within me. While the sound of the crowd diminished and the arena lights began to fade, I realized that moment meant much more to my journey than any other victory. Throughout my career, I had always sought to be the best, reach the top, overcome all obstacles with physical strength and technique. But this experience showed me something deeper. True victory doesn't lie in becoming the best, but in facing and overcoming one's own vulnerability. It wasn't a victory of gold or trophies, but a personal victory, something no one could take from me. I knew the path to get there hadn't been easy, neither for the horse nor for me. The recovery journey, the fear of failure, the exhausting training, and finally the return to the arena, all of this contributed to the person I was at that moment. I had faced what many find impossible, returning to the rodeo after a major injury, returning with shaken confidence, and still overcoming all of this. What touched me most that day was realizing that the true testimony of overcoming isn't in great external victories, but in the ability to continue even when everything seems to crumble. The moment I left the arena, thoughts about what others thought or said were in the background. What really mattered was the feeling of having returned, of having given myself a new chance. That ride wasn't about another victory in a championship. It was about personal rebirth. As I walked through the backstage, I felt an inner peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. The weight of doubt had been replaced by a feeling of freedom. I was lighter, more connected to my own essence. It wasn't about the fear that accompanied me, but about the courage that now dwelt in me. Competition adrenaline no longer dominated me. Instead, it was there, in the background, propelling me to move forward. But what really took hold of me was the sense that I no longer needed to fight against fear. Instead, I had accepted it, and that made me stronger. Accepting vulnerability and moving forward despite it was the greatest achievement I could have. The conversation with my friends and teammates after the ride was also revealing. They reminded me that the most important thing was the fact that I had returned and faced the rodeo, regardless of the result. But even so, something in me said that for me, that moment was more than simply resuming my career. I had regained my confidence, not in the way I imagined, but in a deeper and more lasting way. It was no longer about being the best, but about reconnecting with what really mattered. The arena was no longer just a battlefield to compete, but a reflection of who I am as a person. I wasn't there just to prove something to others. I was there to prove to myself that I could return and be stronger than before. In the days that followed, I realized that moment in the arena had changed something within me. I wasn't the same competitor who entered the arena, not because I had won the ride or obtained a great prize, but because true victory would no longer be measured in trophies, but in my personal journey. There was something deeper that propelled me now. It was a quiet awareness that personal overcoming is a much more important victory than any prize. What the rodeo taught me, once again, was that the greatest challenges are always internal, and that's what makes each victory so significant. Over time, I returned to the arena more times, and the confidence I built in those moments wasn't something that was lost. It was no longer about winning a championship or reaching the top. It was about being there, competing, knowing that each challenge would be faced with more wisdom, with more heart, and above all, with more resilience. I finally understood what the rodeo represented for me. It wasn't about being the best, but about facing the impossible, moving forward, and getting up every time life knocks us down. The moment I left the arena that day wasn't about recognition from others, but about recognition from myself. I knew deep down that this was the true victory. While the silence of the arena settled after the ride, a feeling of tranquility began to take hold of me. What I had lived that day, not just in the arena, but also in every moment of my recovery, was crystallizing as something much bigger than simple competition. The fear, doubt, insecurity, and anxieties that accompanied me during the recovery process and return to the arena had shown me something I never imagined. True strength doesn't come from the absence of fear, but from the ability to move forward despite it. In the days following the ride, I was unable to get what had happened out of my mind. I realized I hadn't just beaten a bull or performed a good ride. I had conquered something much more valuable. I had regained my confidence. Fear didn't disappear, nor did it go away instantly. No, it was still there, and always will be, but I learned that fear isn't my enemy. It's just a challenge to be faced. I saw it in a new way. It doesn't have the power to control me unless I allow it to. What really matters, and what I learned at that moment, is that I have control over how I react to it. While reflecting on this experience, I realized that throughout my career, I had always sought to be the best, seek perfection, achieve grandiose objectives. But now, I understand that the rodeo, like life, isn't about reaching an ideal of perfection, but about how we deal with the challenges life imposes on us. Each competition, each ride, each adversity isn't just a battle against the bull or against the clock, but against ourselves. They are a way to test our resilience, our ability to grow and adapt. Returning to the arena was an experience of self-discovery. It wasn't about being better than others or proving something to the audience. I realized that the true meaning of the rodeo, and perhaps of life, is that it doesn't matter how much you fall, but how much you get up. The fear of failing, doubt, pressure, all of this is part of the journey. But true victory lies in learning to deal with this and over time being able to overcome them. And that's what the rodeo taught me again. True overcoming is internal. It begins in our mind, in the heart, in our ability to rebuild ourselves after each fall. I also began to understand the true meaning of resilience. During recovery, I thought being resilient was just enduring pain and moving forward. But reflecting on my journey, I realized that being resilient isn't just enduring difficult moments, it's learning from them. Every time we